A two-story historic home with yellow clapboard siding and black shutters.
When you visit this site, you're confronted with the layers of American history that make up its different foundations.
Historic illustration of the home.
From 1759, when the house was built and inhabited by people with a slave-created fortune.
An animated montage.
To Washington's arrival 16 years later through the era of independence, and Longfellow's recreation of some of those founding moments as a binding cultural mythology for a new nation, right to the eve of the Civil War, where it threatened to come undone again. And I don't think you can see that anywhere better than at this incredible site on Brattle Street.
The animated montage depicts George Washington, Paul Revere, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. An animated image of the house transitions into reality. A title appears, The Past and Present Here Unite.
If you were living in the 1840s, the country was only, 60 years old, and there were many questions on what is actually the future of the United States going to be.
Carrie Greenidge.
Longfellow was essential for creating narratives of what it meant to be part of a country that was emerging from this revolutionary moment, a way that people could make sense of their time.
Christoph Irmscher.
Longfellow believed that the most American poet was one who combined in him all the traditions of the world. He spoke 9 languages fluently.
Gold leaf illustrated book covers.
He was beloved throughout the world.
Nicholas A. Basbanes.
He was translated into 30-odd plus languages. His impact went beyond the poetry. It permeated music, culture. You saw things like a box of Longfellow cigars. There was Longfellow soap. There were Longfellow playing cards.
An animated depiction of street vendors.
He was up to his armpits in letters, thousands and thousands of letters.
Animated Longfellow with endless stacks of letters.
He had a kind of position in culture that today we would only think of as major pop musicians.
Animated crowd waves at Longfellow.
He was essentially the greatest media celebrity of his age.
Dana Gioia.
Longfellow understood from the beginning of his residence there that he was in a historic place.
The front of Longfellow House.
He was aware that the Vassal family, the original owners of the house, they had kept slaves there.
Moving through elegant gateposts towards the rear of the house.
Being able to actually map out that you are standing on a place where we know that people were enslaved is a powerful testament.
Looking up at the house.
The Vassal family were loyalists, which meant that when the Revolutionary War began, the Vassals went to Boston to seek protection from the British troops.
Historic illustration of call to arms.
April 1775, there were tens of thousands of provincial militiamen ringed around Boston.
Historic map of Boston.
There were now thousands of British soldiers stuck inside Boston. That was the beginning of the siege of Boston.
George Washington arrived at the Vassal estate and uses it as his headquarters.
Painting of Vassal home.
The Vassal estate at the time was a large country estate
J.L. Bell.
overlooking a river with an enslaved labor force. It probably reminded him of Mount Vernon.
Painting of Mount Vernon.
Washington, a believer in American liberty, is himself a man who is made of enslaved people.
Historic illustration of Washington speaking to enslaved worker.
He comes to Massachusetts as a Virginian, a person who they would have said was from another country, and takes charge of what becomes the first United States institution, the Continental Army.
Jane Kamensky.
He was not at all confident about his ability to take on this job, and he had a lot to learn.
Portrait of George Washington.
He had to learn how to organize the army. He had to learn how to work with civilian governments. Eventually, troops from Pennsylvania, from Virginia and Maryland arrived, like him, sort of symbolizing that the entire continent was behind this effort. Washington's mustermaster general wrote a letter from the House which used the phrase, "the United States of America." That appears to be the first time that phrase was used in writing.
Portrait of George Washington.
Washington eventually, in March 1776, was able to celebrate the first victory of his campaign in the Revolutionary War when the British Army finally left Boston.
Historic illustration of colonial troops watching British fleet sailing away.
around 1826, the immediate wake of the American Revolution. Longfellow starts his career as a writer, participating in the ongoing work of defining the nation by words.
An elegant room with dark wood furniture.
Where Longfellow worked, where he composed all of his great poems, had also served as the office of George Washington.
An animated scene of Longfellow writing in his study.
Once, once, within these walls, one whom memory oft recalls, the father of his country, dwelt. Up and down these echoing stairs, heavy with the weight of cares, sounded his majestic tread.
The Longfellow House is a place where some of the greatest poems in American literature were written, and where some of the greatest writers of the 19th century gathered to talk about literature, politics, and ideas.
Historic photos of Fanny.
Fanny Longfellow was part of that circle as well. Longfellow's marriage was a deeply egalitarian one. They would discuss his works, but also works by other writers.
Photo of Henry, Fanny, and boys.
He was very involved in the raising of his children. Being a head of a family was both important to Longfellow and a part of his public image.
Painting of Longfellow daughters. Then an animated scene in the home.
A sudden rush from the stairway, a sudden raid from the hall. By 3 doors left unguarded, they enter my castle wall. They climb up into my turret or the arms and back of my chair. If I try to escape, they surround me. They seem to be everywhere.
He was a fireside poet, which is to say, one of the poets that the mother or the father would read aloud to the family in front of the fireplace in the evening.
There wasn't cinema. There wasn't the radio. So the poet was the radio. The poet was the megaphone. The poet was the film.
Christina Davis, then an animated Paul Revere on horseback.
Until Longfellow wrote about Paul Revere, most people didn't know his story.
Longfellow wasn't creating history. He was creating a myth. He was creating a legend and a story that would inspire Americans.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Listening to the poem, delivering the poem, actually makes history come alive.
So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm.
It's a call to action, essentially. It's a call to renew the promise of America.
A voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore.
Readers forget that Paul Revere's ride is not just about the Revolutionary War. It also prophesies the beginning of the Civil War, in which Paul Revere's spirit is necessary to awaken Americans to preserve the Republic and abolish slavery.
Animated crowd arguing, then an animated Paul Revere on horseback.
In the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere.
Animated chains breaking.
By the time Longfellow writes Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the nation is on the verge of coming apart.
Historic political cartoon.
He used funds from the publication of these poems to fund Black churches, Black newspapers, Black organizations, and helping enslaved people come to the North and seek freedom.
Longfellow was an anti-slavery person, but he was not necessarily a radical abolitionist. Radical abolitionists were people like Charles Sumner, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, people who really believed that African-American people and the formerly enslaved deserved equal rights once slavery ended. Longfellow was definitely sort of ambivalent about that aspect.
Historic illustration of Longfellow at writing desk.
He wrote a series of poems on slavery, in which he considers the experience of enslaved people. And there's a poem in particular, I think, that is very striking to me.
Danielle Legros George's then animated scene.
These are the bones of slaves. They gleam from the abyss. They cry from yawning waves. We are the witnesses.
Sinking underwater, eyes are revealed.
It is a great poem of witness. It is an engaged poem, a poem that is a work of advocacy, an important work.
His poems on slavery are part of this long tradition of New England artists and writers who engaged with the time that they were living in, which were these times of uncertainty about the future of the nation.
Map of U.S. is torn apart, then an animated scene of shipbuilding.
Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
He was crying out for the preservation of the Union, even though he was writing about the building of a ship. And that resonated.
Photo of President Lincoln.
When that poem was read to Lincoln during the darkest days of the Civil War, he is said to have been brought to tears.
Photo of historic London with billowing smoke.
During the darkest hours of the Battle of Britain,
Photo of President Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt, he wrote that very famous line and sent it to Churchill, which Churchill repeated on the BBC. This is a poem that really transcended. I mean, it was written in 1849. Here it is, 100 years later, still having resonance and an impact and touching people not only in the United States, but throughout the world.
Marble bust of Longfellow with beard.
There are phrases from Longfellow's poems that have become part of our language today.
Ships passing in the night, the patter of little feet.
I shot an arrow into the air.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Into each life some rain must fall.
Footprints in the sands of time.
These are phrases that are so ingrained in our language that it's hard to believe that one man came up with them.
Longfellow's writing stand.
Language remembers the poet, even if the people don't.
Photo of Longfellow with white beard.
Dead he is not, but departed, for the artist never dies.
He was nation building through his poems. He sought to speak to the everyday person.
Whether you know it or not, Longfellow has shaped your idea of America. We had a country without its own stories. Longfellow created a series of poems which gave America a set of stories or even myths by which we've really lived ever since.
Paul Revere statue, then montage of the house.
The story of Longfellow House and George Washington, the Vassal family, means that the country from its birth has these complications within it. That complexity is actually a wonderful way to engage with understanding the past. That's the beauty of having a site like this site.
A view of the house from the front with American flag waving. Fade to black. Credits appear including produced for the National Park Service by Argentine Productions. Director, Peter Argentine. Writers, Peter Argentine, Eric Argentine. Producers, Peter Argentine, Eric Argentine. Executive producers, Peter Argentine, Amber Hodges, NPS. Director of Photography, Jeff Garden. Editor, Per Argentine. Animator, Pat Bradley, Spring Shoe Animation. Composers, Mark Orton and John Hancock. Henry Longfellow voiceover, David Mason. Audio description, Mia Bocella. This program was made possible by entrance fees collected by National Park visitors. Thank you for your support.